Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GDDV 100 Game Theory 1. My name is Kasanas. Guys, we are moving along really well with this. We're moving along really well. We've gone ahead and talked about narrative for most of the last few episodes. We started off with an introduction to narrative, we talked about conflict, and today we're going to move on to continued with narratives. What we're going to do, we're going to finish it up today, and really we're just going to talk about whether or not narrative belongs in games and options for narrative within games. All right, everyone, let's get started. So guys, let's just jump right into it. Let's continue on with narrative, and I'm going to start off with a question. Should we care about story in games? And I hope, based on the last few videos, that you think that we should. I personally think we should. And I'm not talking about the idea of ludology versus narratology or anything like that. That debate's old, and I don't know if there's really a winning side to that particular debate. What I am talking about is whether or not story is involved in your games at all. And in my personal opinion, it is. Regardless of whether or not you are intentionally including story within your game, your audience, your players are going to add their own story to it. There's a ton of videos online on YouTube, and I'll try and include some links in this particular video, where people are using a Rube Goldberg machine and they've added an entire plot line to the actions involved with the machine. Or there's an entire marbles racing league that's out there where marbles are sent racing, and there's an announcer, and they go through the entire event of this marble racing. And these are inanimate objects. So even in the simple rolling of a ball or a marble, for example, people automatically add context. And I think that in most cases, in almost any game, people are going to add context. So whether or not you want narrative to be involved, it's going to be. We already talked about how important things like conflict is within the story, and how important conflict is, or something obstacles that are standing in your way of achieving your goal as far as a game is concerned. That's really what makes a game, right? If there's something standing in your way and you have to overcome that particular obstacle, then you've got yourself a game. So conflict is important in narrative, and it's important within games. So even in creating that conflict, there's automatically a story there. Something's stopping you from doing something. That in itself is a story, right? In a lot of cases within film or literature, our narrative is delivered through things like descriptive text or dialogue or things like that. But in games, we don't have that option, right? We don't have that. We have very little dialogue in our games. So there's got to be other ways that we can present narrative to our audience, and there is. So how exactly can we express narrative in games with so little dialogue involved? A film is 2 hours of dialogue, or 2 hours of dialogue, whereas within a game you might have no dialogue whatsoever. So how is it exactly that we can present narrative within games? And we have a bunch of different options. We have a whole bunch of different options. Your gameplay and your mechanics, your dynamics, all of them support a narrative of some kind, right? If your character can do specific things, there's a reason why the character can do specific things. As soon as your characters are moving or anything else, there's going to be narrative attached to it. Level design and world design are huge when it comes to environmental storytelling. You've got yourself a particular level, you've got yourself an entire world, and that world is automatically creating stories. If you've got background characters yelling things out, fish for sale, or something like that, you've got a story right there, and your audience, your players are automatically going to create that story in their own head. Obviously, with an RPG, you typically have advanced story anyway. But through your level design, through what the players see, through environmental storytelling, they're automatically going to determine something about your world. Even if you've got a really simple game with just a ball jumping around the screen, as soon as you add in some type of background image, it's going to tell a story. The world that this ball lives in looks a certain way, and there's certain things that you can tell based on that background art. So all of that is pretty darn important, right? Character design and background characters. So your characters obviously have a story of their own. As soon as your players see an image that represents an avatar that represents characters of any kind, they're going to add context to those avatars. They're going to say, obviously, this character who's dressed in rags is poor, and this character who's dressed in a top hat and a monocle is rich. You might suggest that. Just seeing simple symbols on particular characters are going to say something. If you see the Batman symbol, for example, you automatically associate that with hero, with Batman, right? Or the S in Superman, that's automatically associated with very particular things. So even symbology and symbols on your character are going to add context whether or not you want it to. A backpack on a character suggests to travel. A lasso or a cowboy hat suggests a background to that character. That character is obviously a cowboy, right? And this is automatically being added. You don't have to say a word about it. As soon as your player sees the character design and they see these background characters, or they hear the characters in any way, so there's different idle audio that might be associated with your character or background characters. As soon as they hear this is going to automatically create a context in which your game exists. Sound design, I've already mentioned that. Sound design is going to go a long way. By creating yourself a soundscape, it's going to imply something about your world, right? If we hear industrial noises of some kind, it's going to imply that we are in a factory or we're in some type of industrial plant, right? As soon as you hear these things, even if you have no visuals, you could create an entire game, an entire world, in an entire game in a world without any visuals whatsoever, strictly through sound design, right? So your sound goes a long way in telling the story. You don't have to have dialogue. There's also very traditional methods like cutscenes and dialogue points, and these are interesting. I teach an entire course in cinematography for games, and in cinematography for games, we talk about the idea of cutscenes and dialogue points, and we talk about what it does to player immersion. It's not that we don't use cutscenes or dialogue points anymore. We still do, but there's often a shared control between the player and the system itself as they're delivering these cutscenes or they're delivering these dialogue points. Things are changing a little bit, right? We don't often have or I shouldn't say we don't often. We still do. We still have in games in the traditional cutscenes where we'll stop gameplay and move into a cutscene and tell the story itself. And that's obviously a fantastic option still. But in a lot of cases, we're trying to keep our players immersed by allowing them some control or cutting back and forth quickly. That's an entirely separate topic, and you're going to be seeing on this channel, you're going to be seeing cinematography for game videos as well. So follow along with those if you're interested in it. Cinematography for game and game camera, right? A lot of this goes a long way in telling a story, allowing your players to focus on particular things, giving them different camera control, utilizing different techniques within your world to set up composition within your frame. All of this kind of stuff is going to add to the context of your game. It's going to add narrative to your game. When we talk about narrative in games, it has a very particular purpose. The particular purpose of narrative in games is to create a specific mood or feeling in your player. And that's what we want to do as far as games are concerned in general, right? Having our player become immersed within our game because they are dedicated to what's occurring on the screen. It's making them feel something. You're dragging them into the game by creating a specific mood and invoking a feeling within the player itself. The narrative goes a long way in doing that. And we talked about that already, about how an engaging narrative can have a very direct effect on the player's immersion level, where they'll become more engaged with the storytelling that's there. So including a narrative within your game, adding context to your game, gives your player often a reason why they're doing things, right? Having them understand the reason why they are doing specific things is really important. Not making it a random I'm doing this for no reason at all. I'm the bad guy because of this. Understanding the underlying context of a game is going to make the story itself and the game itself more engaging. And I've already talked about traditional narratives and the use of traditional narrative for cutscenes, dialogues, and narrative points, that kind of thing in delivering this. I've already talked about environmental storytelling and how important it is that the player can understand where they are and what they're doing and who they might be based on what they see visually through just environment, through just level setup and level design, level dressing really. Is what it comes down to, not really level design. We'll talk about level design in the future. And visual storytelling. So a lot of things, like I talked about how symbolism can play an extremely important role in the narrative of your game and how much information a simple symbol can deliver, right? You see the Batman logo and you immediately know the entire background to that. You see a religious symbol of some kind and there's a whole bunch of connotation associated with that religious symbol. There's a lot of stuff that we get from symbolism. It is a very important topic. If you aren't studying symbolism and you want to be involved in set dressing or you want to be a concept artist or anything like that, symbolism is something you really should be looking at. All right, guys. So now that we've talked about different ways we can express it, it's important to understand that there are ways of delivering this narrative as well. There's a straightforward linear narrative, and a straightforward linear narrative is going to allow you to tell a story sequentially, right? The player is going to experience that in a sequential fashion. Their actions are going to have not a great effect on the story itself, because you've written the story and this is what's going to occur. In a non-linear narrative, if you're offering your players a non-linear narrative or a branching path narrative, then you're offering your players choice, and those choices are going to have a direct effect on the story itself. It's not necessarily true that one or the other of these types of delivery, linear or nonlinear, are going to have a larger effect on immersion. If your players engage in the story that they're creating, then they're going to be interested in the linear narrative as well. However, giving your players choice and having them understand the choices that they make and how it affects their play can also be extremely engaging, right? One of the big problems with a nonlinear narrative is that you may write or you may create assets, or you may create different quests and different narrative points that the players will never see. So you're putting a lot of work into something that maybe will never be seen by the player, unless, of course, your game has replay value. If there's replay value associated with your game, then they might go through and play the alternative paths. With a linear narrative, they've gone through it, they've experienced everything you have to offer them. Their choices don't really make a huge difference in that linear path anyway, so they might not be able to replay your game very often. Just a quick diagram here demonstrating different types of narrative paths, and these are pretty straightforward. Starting off with choice, if we've got on one side, if we start off on the left, what we've got here is a starting point and then branching narrative. And this branching narrative is going to allow you to go in different directions and have multiple endings to your game. So moving downwards from the initial start, you can end up with several different paths that you're going to take, which will ultimately lead to several different endings in your game, right? There's a lot of replay involved in this kind of game. They might go through and replay this several times to see all of the endings of your game. But that's a lot of work. Having all these different endings they're a lot of work, right? You have to create all these different things, and a lot of it might never be seen by anyone. In the second example, in the center example here, we've got ourselves a simple branching path where we start off going one way, we branch out, and we come back to the main story point. This could be like a side quest or something like that. But once again, what we do see here is that we've skipped over some of the information that you've created, right? There's some replay here. And again, we've got several different endings. So we've kind of got a mixture between linear and branching path, where we've got this main quest with these side branches as well. And the last one is going to offer several different starting points, but a single ending point, right? This is how the story ends regardless of which way we go. I guess there's two different options within this one here. There's kind of an early end to the game, and then there is a finalized end of the game. But the number of choices is going to be limited, and they kind of come together. You've got these kind of like hub sections where you're coming together. And again, we're going to see these exact same diagrams later on when we start to talk about the idea of level design. Level design can work in exactly the same way. So you can deliver your narrative either through a linear means or through a branching path. There's pros and cons to both. All right, guys, I think we're going to end narrative at this point. What I want to get into and what we're really going to be focusing on in the last video in this particular section is the idea of world building, right? This is what it all comes to. We can tell a lot of, we can give our players a lot of information about the game and about the underlying context to the game simply through world building. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this particular video, and that's going to bring us to the end of narrative. If you enjoyed it, let me know down below with a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down is fine, guys. I don't mind at all. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this particular way of teaching. I'm teaching asynchronously. I'm delivering this information. It's not super exciting. We're just looking at my slide sheets here, but I'm hoping you guys are getting some information, and I hope it's helpful. Let me know if you are down in the comments. All right, everyone? Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.